Supreme Court justices are now weighing a landmark case surrounding presidential tariff powers. President Trump says if the case doesn't go his way, it would have, quote, devastating impacts. He teared into the case on Truth Social, slamming the notion that the president is allowed to stop trade with a country entirely, but may not be able to deliver tariffs. Let's bring in former federal prosecutor Fred Thiese. Fred, great to have you here. Thanks for being with us this Sunday. The general observation, I think, from a lot of legal experts after the Supreme Court arguments was that the Supreme Court justices were leaning against President Trump on this one. Is that the way you saw it?
Well, it's interesting, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me. Anybody who tells you that they can tell you how the Supreme Court's going to rule, or any court for that matter, based upon the questions during oral argument, is somewhere just this side of a snake oil salesman. Who knows? It's hard to tell. I think based upon the questions I've heard, there are issues with which a number of the justices, including conservative justices, are wrestling, but we don't know. I've been doing this for decades. I've walked out of oral arguments thinking that I have no chance of winning based upon the questions I've gotten, and I've walked out of oral arguments thinking that I can't lose, and neither one of them came out the way I wanted.
Scott Bessent was talking recently about the tariffs and the effect they have had. Let's listen to the Treasury Secretary briefly here, Fred.
President Trump has consistently fought for the American worker, and we are seeing trillions of investments in the U.S. that would not have occurred without the tariffs. On October 8th, Chinese threatened to put export controls on rare earth materials. He was able to threaten 100% tariffs, and we were able to negotiate that away.
So, Fred, the administration argument seems to have been that tariffs are part of economic policy, a strategy that gives the president the power to impose them. The other argument is that, no, they're a tax and only Congress can impose taxes on the American people. How would you break that down?
So there's a couple of different things going on here, Jonathan. The first is, yes, it's correct that under Article 1, Congress has the sole authority to generate revenue and to tax. And secondly, our founding fathers were really, really, really smart, and they created a system of justice, a system of governance that has checks and balances. And you can't be given the executive power too much power. The executive branch too much power, and I get that. I mean, and that's true irrespective of who's president, whether it's President Obama or President Biden or President Trump. The executive branch has to kind of stay in its lane. Having said that, okay, the bottom line is this. I can understand why people are concerned about overextending executive power. But let's not forget that these are probably the same people who over the last couple of decades have engaged in kind of economic policy that has devastated the middle class, sent millions and millions of jobs overseas. And so I kind of question their motivation. As far as how I think this is going to come out, someone much wiser than I once said, the Supreme Court reads the paper and they get it. You're talking about $100 billion. And this isn't money that's going to the executive branch. This is money that's going into the federal coffers for the good of the American people, including for Congress who want to spend it on things that they think are important, some of which you or I may not agree with. But ultimately, I think the Supreme Court does have the authority to just say in the very narrow circumstances under this IEEA, the Economic Emergency Act, that the president has the right to impose tariffs. That act has been held to allow the president to impose licenses. And so whether you call it a license or you call it a tariff, and the president's right. He can just say, guess what? You're not coming here at all, period. Now what?
Fred, let me get to another topic quickly with you. The administration push to require biological sex to be registered on passports. What do you make of that?
I question what percentage of the population this really does affect. But ultimately, people have the right to decide who they want to be. I don't have a problem with that. But the bottom line is that the government has a compelling interest of making sure that people are properly identified, and the kind of a hard and fast way to do that is what was your sex at birth, what's your chromosomal sex, and so the question is how intrusive was the government's act? I mean, I think the government has a right to do what it needs to do to make sure that people are properly identified, and people who are upset about that, I mean, I understand where they're coming from, but the government's got to be able to do its job.
Yeah, and real quick, Fred, the ruling by a judge on the National Guard being permanently banned from going into Portland, does that ruling hold, do you believe?
Good question. Yeah, it's interesting. That judge was, I believe, a Trump appointee, and the judge heard a lot of evidence. And I think, it was what the law calls a preliminary injunction motion. So the question is whether or not the government has shown a likelihood of success on the merits. So the appeal from there is to the Ninth Circuit. Not a big favor of the president, that court. So we'll see. I mean, I think ultimately it has to wind its way up to the Supreme Court. Part, I think, the problem in that case, Jonathan, was just that there was kind of compelling testimony from the chief of police of the city of Portland that it wasn't as dangerous as everybody makes it out to seem. How accurate that was, that's not for me to say.
Yep. Fred Tisi, always great to see you. Thank you for your expertise, sir. Have a great Sunday.
Thanks, Evan. Take care. Enjoy your day.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.